In the post-exilic period, a scribe named Ezra was sent from Persia to Jerusalem with a mission to deliver scripture and law to the people living there. Upon his arrival, he gave to the people the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, as, according to the Bible, the people of Jerusalem lacked any scriptures of their own. Sweeping changes were instituted, and the population found themselves subject to strange new laws, including the prohibition of intermarriage. Scholars debate to this day whether Ezra actually existed, but the changes instituted in his name are clear. The people of Israel are meant to be ethnically distinct from their neighbors. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons and Genesis. Now that we're finished with the books of Kings, we're going to backtrack a bit, or spring forward, depending on which version of the Old Testament you're consulting. Today we're examining the Book of Ruth. In the Tanakh, Ruth is found between the Song of Songs and Lamentations. In most other versions, it's located between Judges and 1 Samuel. This makes sense chronologically, as the story is set several generations before King David, when the land of Israel was still ruled by tribal leaders known as judges. However, this story was written during the time of the chronicler in order to redact certain parts of the fictive Deuteronomic history. Like the character of Ruth herself, the book seems to travel around a bit. So, before we continue too far along on our path, we'll cover the Book of Ruth so it doesn't get lost in the shuffle. The Book of Ruth is often read during Shavuot, the Jewish festival of weeks. Like most religious holidays of importance, it's centered around agriculture, and it takes place 7 weeks after Passover. The Jews were released from slavery on Passover, and on Shavuot they were given the Torah by Yahweh. This period in between is the grain harvest, which provides bread for the entire year. So naturally, it would be bookended by a pair of bread-themed celebrations: Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and Shavuot, the end of the grain harvest. The reason Ruth is read during this time is because that's when the main action of the story takes place. The first chapter sets the stage with background information. The remainder of the book, chapters 2 through 4, all occur during the grain harvest. One important detail of note before we get started is that despite the story occurring at this time, there is no mention of the Passover at all. Now, this may seem insignificant, but considering Passover's importance in Judaism, sharing prominence with the Day of Atonement as the 2 most important days in the entire year, you'd expect the author to mention the detail, especially since Ruth 1:22 tells us that they arrived in Bethlehem at the very beginning of the harvest, which is immediately following Passover. Maybe I'm looking too closely at this, but I find it a bit peculiar that our protagonist arrives in town immediately after the festival which begins the harvest, and the authors show no awareness of that festival's existence. It makes me wonder when the Passover celebration was actually established. See the previous episode in which we're told in 2 Kings 23 that Passover was established by Josiah during his reforms, because it was prescribed in a new scroll which was unknown to the Jews in previous generations. Now, I'm not saying this story predates the establishment of Passover, but it's something to keep in mind. So let's get started. In the opening line of Ruth, we are informed of the time period, meaning the author is aware of the timeline established by the previous books of the Bible. It tells us, "in the days when the judges ruled." So our author is aware that the short story collection of the Book of Judges has been established as part of the nation's fictive history, and we're to imagine that this story occurred during that time period. A man named Elimelech left Bethlehem in Judah and traveled to Moab with his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Elimelech is a pious man, which is reflected in his name, which means God is my king. We'll see that everyone in this story bears names appropriate for their personality or their role within the tale. The sons married Moabite women named Orpah and Ruth. But both sons and their father all die in verses 3 through 5, leaving Naomi with 2 daughters-in-law and no male heirs. But of course the sons died. The names Mahlon and Chilion mean weakness and consumption, respectively. We have a couple of things to examine here. First, we have Jews marrying foreign women. We're specifically warned against Israelites fraternizing with Moabite women in Numbers 25, when Yahweh sent a plague that killed 24,000 Jews because an Israelite man took a Moabite wife. Resolving the issue and ending the plague required the high priest Phinehas to impale both the man and his wife with a spear. But these Jews weren't in Israel at the time, so perhaps it doesn't matter. And there's no way that any Moabite women will marry an Israelite dude in this story while inside the Promised Land. I mean, that sort of taboo just wouldn't happen. Spoiler alert, it does. The next problem we have here concerns property rights. Elimelech had 2 male heirs to inherit his property, but both of them died. And since neither of them had conceived sons with their respective wives, there is now no one to inherit Elimelech's property. Property rights were of great importance in Israel, as we saw in Genesis 38 with the story of Onan. When he refused to father a child with his brother's widow, Yahweh struck him dead. A man needed a male heir to carry on his line and inherit his property, even if that heir wasn't biologically his. Though we did see in Numbers 27 that if no male heir was available, the daughters could inherit the property. So this story either predates that custom, or the author of Ruth didn't agree with the practice. And also, these are not Israelite women, but Moabites, so maybe they don't qualify. So Naomi has 2 daughters-in-law, and she needs to find them husbands so they can inherit Elimelech's property. Otherwise, Naomi will be destitute because, as a woman, she had no claim on her husband's belongings. She sets out for Judah, but Orpah is unfaithful to her new family, and so she decides to remain in Moab. This is foreshadowed by her name, which literally means unfaithful. Naomi learned that Yahweh is sending down bread from heaven in Israel, so she decided to return to Judah. In Exodus 16, Psalm 78 and 105, Malachi 3, Nehemiah 9, and 2 Kings 7, we learn of Yahweh opening up the storehouses of heaven and dropping down heavenly grain upon the earth to aid his favorite people. Here in Ruth 2 is another example. So during the grain harvest, Yahweh is supplementing the food supply with heavenly grain. Another example in a growing list of Yahweh as a grain god. Ruth follows Naomi home to become like an Israelite, which means to become a resident alien. These are foreigners who live in Israel and are protected by certain laws which were common for foreign residents in the ancient world. Upon arriving in Bethlehem, the city celebrated Naomi's return. We aren't told how anyone knew that the random lady who walked in on the other side of town was someone who had left with her husband a decade earlier, or why they would spontaneously throw a party, but apparently they all did. She tells them Yahweh has dealt bitterly with her. The name Naomi literally means bitter. And in case you're wondering, her faithful companion Ruth, who decides to accompany her mother-in-law to Bethlehem, well, Ruth means companion. This return to Bethlehem, as noted before, coincided with the beginning of the wheat harvest. In the beginning of chapter 2, we learned that Naomi's deceased husband was related to a wealthy man named Boaz. As this was the time of the harvest, Ruth is sent into the fields to glean as much grain as she can. This was a common practice in ancient Israel. Their law code stipulated that a portion of the harvest had to be left in the field for travelers and foreigners to gather. The laborers would harvest grain, vegetables, or fruit, but leave a percentage of it on the plants. Resident aliens could come behind and take what they wanted from what remained. This is what Ruth is doing in chapter 2, coming in behind the workers to gather up what she could from the fields. Boaz learned that Ruth had come with Naomi and instructed his workers not to touch her and informed her that she could drink from the same vessels as everyone else. When she asks why Boaz is being so kind to her, he responds by stating that he knew of the tragedies that befell her family and that she could seek shelter beneath Yahweh's wings. So we must ask ourselves, is this just a metaphor, or does the author literally imagine Yahweh as a winged deity? Personally, I think it's just a metaphor, but considering some of the strange imagery we've already seen concerning divine figures in the Old Testament, I wouldn't rule out the possibility. When lunchtime arrives, Boaz invites Ruth to join the ordinary workers for her meal, so she doesn't have to fend for herself. The text doesn't indicate what their meal was, but I'm guessing a taco truck visited. When they return to work, Boaz tells his workers to harvest some extra barley for Ruth to supplement her own harvest, so she doesn't just have to rely on the leavings. Naomi inquired as to Ruth's whereabouts when she returned to town that evening, and Ruth tells her mother-in-law about the kindness of Boaz. Upon hearing the man's name, Naomi instructs Ruth to return to his field every day for the duration of the harvest. As you can guess, Naomi sees a solution to her inheritance problem in Ruth and the wealthy Boaz. Her idea for a solution is expressed in the beginning of chapter 3, where she begins suggesting to Ruth that the girl go to Boaz so that she can find a home. She cleans up her daughter-in-law and anoints her with oil, and then helps her to dress in an attractive manner. She then gives Ruth explicit instructions for her next encounter with Boaz that involves approaching him after he retires for the evening. So that night when Boaz is asleep, Ruth does as instructed and removes the covering from his feet and lies beside him. Boaz then awakes with a start and asks who she is. She identifies herself as Ruth and asks if he would cover her with his robe, a symbol of a covenant between two people, as is seen in Ezekiel 16:8. So she lies at his feet for the duration of the night and returned home before dawn. He also gives her 6 measures of barley to take to Naomi's house, where she remained until she learned what Boaz intended to do with her. In the 4th and final chapter of Ruth, Boaz meets with the 10 elders of the town concerning Naomi's plight and Elimelech's property. It's agreed that Boaz will acquire the man's property along with Ruth, whom he will take as a wife, as was customary according to the rules of the levirate marriage of Deuteronomy 25. Everything that was owned by Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion would now belong to Boaz, so that Elimelech's name would not perish. To finalize the agreement, we're told that the representative handed over his sandal to signify the closing of the deal. In Ruth 4:7, we learn that this was a practice in earlier times, meaning that this story is written long after such practices had fallen out of fashion, and the audience wouldn't likely understand the meaning of the act, so the significance is included here in the text. In verse 11, the elders and all the people gathered around to chant that Yahweh will make Ruth like Rachel and Leah, who built up the land of Israel, giving us our first hint of Ruth's destiny, or rather that of her descendants. It also states, "May her descendants be like the family of Perez, the son of Tamar and Judah." This is significant because the situation with Tamar and Judah is similar to that of Ruth and Boaz. In Genesis, Tamar's husband the eldest son of Judah, dies before she can conceive a son. Thus, there is no one to inherit his property. So his brother Onan is sent to impregnate her with a son to serve as heir. But he interrupts the act, so Yahweh strikes him dead. Judah then decides that his eldest son Shelah would be the one to do the deed once he's old enough, but Judah doesn't give the boy to Tamar when he grows up. So Tamar takes matters into her own hands and disguises herself as a prostitute to intercept Judah, her father-in-law, while he's on his travels, in order to get pregnant by him. This fulfilled the levirate marriage requirement, and she bore twins, Perez and Zerah. And there are two things of interest to point out in this little detour down the rabbit hole. First, these two sexually scandalous women, Tamar and Ruth, are both listed in Matthew's Gospel in the genealogy of Jesus, which tells us that Mary was pregnant before she was married to Joseph, which may be the author's way of telling us that Jesus wasn't a legitimate son and Mary was guilty of some sexual impropriety. The second detail is that Perez is nearly identical to the Hebrew word for Persia and the root word for Pharisee, which might denote another example of Persian influence on the Hebrew text. What's also interesting is that in the Ethiopic tradition, Perez became the king of Persia. So, how will Ruth's descendants live up to all the hype? In verses 13 to 16 of chapter 4, we're told that she bore Boaz a son named Obed, who then became the father of Jesse, who begat David. But something is amiss in these verses. Verses 14 to 17 have the women of town chanting, "Praise be to Yahweh, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel." They then give him the name Obed, and typical to Bible fashion and formula, there's a reason for his name, and that reason is given in the same verse. And this is where we discover our problem, or problems, plural. The women are chanting this about Naomi, not Ruth, specifically stating that it is Naomi who begot a son, and he is named for being her son. Now, this name should be Ben-Naom, the son of Naomi, but it's been changed to Obed, meaning servant of God. So, what happened? How did Naomi have a son if Boaz married and impregnated Ruth? And how did his name get changed from meaning a son of Naomi, as the text clearly states is the reason for the name, to Obed, the grandfather of David? Let's untangle this mess. The story of Naomi finding an inheritance redeemer has been co-opted, and this fragment from the original story wasn't edited out. It's a classic example of editorial fatigue. Since this story takes place in Bethlehem, which was later used as a birthplace for King David, Naomi's child was renamed to be the father of Jesse, who likewise lived in Bethlehem. And this entire story was co-opted to argue against the practice of excluding marriage to foreign women in Nehemiah 13 and Ezra 10. So according to the Book of Ruth, marrying a foreign woman is not only okay, such a union led to Israel's greatest king. The entire story also serves to promote the levirate marriage and how such unions also produce legitimate heirs. The book then concludes with a genealogy that stretches from Perez down to David, directly linking the dynastic king with Judah through two women involved in some sketchy sexual acts. But we're not finished with Ruth just yet. In recent years, the Book of Ruth has been touted as the one piece of literature in the Hebrew Bible that portrays women in a positive light. The story follows two women, Naomi and Ruth, as they take control of their own destiny. They're the protagonists of the story, and the book is literally named after one of these women. Some have even pointed to this book as a tale about a lesbian couple finding their way in a patriarchal society where they establish a friendly relationship with the gay Boaz, who then cares for them for the rest of their days. I'm not exactly sure how they reached that conclusion, and I've yet to see a single argument for this interpretation that's even remotely compelling. But if that's how you wish to interpret the story, so be it. But the authors weren't imagining any of that, and a close inspection of Ruth reveals a story that is far from empowering or even pleasant. So let's examine a few details that we glossed over while reviewing the Book of Ruth. First, we'll look at Ruth 1:4, where the sons of Elimelech married Orpah and Ruth. The word used for this specific type of marriage is the same word used in Judges 21:23, where the Benjaminites captured young girls at an annual festival and took them home to be their wives, a sort of rape marriage, which, as we've learned from previous episodes, was condoned by Hebrew law. Capturing a foreign woman was a legitimate form of marriage. Just see Deuteronomy 21 and Numbers 31 for examples of this type of arrangement. At the end of chapter 2, we see Naomi's problem, her lack of any claim to inheritance of Elimelech, and earlier she even states that she can't have any more sons for Orpah and Ruth to marry. So what is her solution? We're told that she recalls Elimelech's relative, the wealthy Boaz, who lives in Bethlehem, and she encourages the younger girl, who's been following her around, to spend every day of the harvest with him as part of the solution. Naomi even goes so far as to groom her to be Boaz's wife. This is because, as Naomi herself stated in chapter 1, they can't wait for her to have additional sons, implying that Naomi is barren. So Naomi is relying on the youth and fertility of Ruth to secure her own future. So Ruth, who may have entered into this family as a captive bride, is now dependent on Naomi, who wishes to exploit Ruth in order to secure her own station. So rather than being a story of self-determination, this might be a story of captive brides and human trafficking, both fully permitted by Hebrew law. This is spelled out quite explicitly in Deborah Kahn Harris's article, What's Rape Culture Got to Do with the Book of Ruth? But when it comes to this topic, she falls short in her article. She overlooks the central action in the Book of Ruth, which culminates in the nighttime rape of the sleeping Boaz by our protagonist. Remember that feet is often a euphemism for penis, so when Ruth approaches the sleeping man and uncovers his feet, she's removing his clothing. So when we're told that Ruth lies at his feet, we understand what this passage actually means and exactly what Naomi instructed her daughter-in-law to do to the sleeping Boaz, who had shown them kindness in the previous chapter. So, while Ruth may have seemed like an uplifting story about two women seizing the day and determining their own future back when it was written, it probably shouldn't be considered that today. It's a story which might very well be centered around a woman who was captured as a girl by Mahlon and lived as his captive bride for a decade before his death freed her from his abuse and landed her under the influence of her mother-in-law, who then carted her off to Israel to serve as her meal ticket in a scheme that involved sexual grooming and the rape of a sleeping benefactor. Of course, these are modern ideals, and in the ancient world, nothing that I just mentioned would have been seen as immoral. The most scandalous detail of this entire book was the idea of marrying a woman from another country. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. If you'd like to support the show, there's an Amazon wish list in a pinned post on my Facebook page. The books in that list help with research for future episodes. You can also shop the merchandise from my Zazzle store, which can be found on that same post. Just visit facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis. And you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/dragonsandgenesis. If you have any questions regarding mythology in the Bible, send them to me at dragonsandgenesis@gmail.com, and I'll answer your question in a video on my YouTube channel over at youtube.com/dragonsandgenesispodcast. Don't forget to give me a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and check out the site over at dragonsandgenesis.com for links, episode information, and a list of recommended reading. And as always, thank you for listening.